goodwill to join in our chorus. Thank you. Thank you very much for your vibrant call, which I hope everyone will be able to join in. I would now like to ask Scott Ritter to intervene, and I would ask Mr. McGovern to be patient for a moment. He's a former intelligence of the U.S. Marine Corps and a former UN weapons inspector. And he was well known in this role as for the UN. So, Mr. Ritter, Scott Ritter, if you're there, you can now take the floor.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Helga, for your inspiring words of introduction. You know, in a perfect world, I think, you know, such an outcome as Helga is seeking, you know, is not only could be possible, but would be possible and would be desirable. But we don't live in a perfect world, and I'm in a position where I've lost confidence in the West to behave as a responsible partner for peace. And it's not just a lack of confidence with the institutions of government, but frankly speaking, I've lost confidence in the Western people, whom have become so enthralled with their consumer-driven lifestyles that they forgive virtually every sin committed by their governments, to include the sin of lying, deceit, not only of others, but the people themselves. But as long as the government aspires to have low energy prices, affordable food, and a modicum of comfort, all is forgiven. And we see that when it comes to the West's approach towards Russia, where every lie is accepted at face value. Every distortion of truth is accepted at face value. Every violation of trust is accepted as business as usual, where the Russians are demonized to the point where a nation of 158 plus million people has been personified into the body of one individual, Vladimir Putin, whom the West doesn't even know how to define properly. The West is incapable of putting Putin in a proper historical context, incapable of appreciating him as a product of modern Russian society, and as such, incapable of dealing with him responsibly when it comes to solving the problems that we are confronting in the world today. You know, only Angela Merkel can answer the question, is she a liar today, or has she always been a liar? But the bottom line is she's a liar. And, you know, there's a principle in American jurisprudence, one lie, all lie. Once she has committed herself as a liar, she can never be trusted. And the same thing with the French, and the same thing with the United States, the same thing with the collective West. So we are asking Russia to deal with liars, to put their national security interests on the line in the hopes that liars will no longer lie. And that's just an irresponsible and unrealistic proposition from the Russian perspective. I know that we in the West would like it to happen, but what we're saying is we have failed, and therefore we are totally dependent upon Russian goodwill to save the day, for the Russians to come to the table and forgive everything and assume good faith, assume good intent. And I don't believe Russia can do that, nor do I believe Russia is willing to do that. In fact, I believe Russia is taking the exact opposite track, that the West, as it currently is configured, cannot be trusted, and that Russia has embraced a policy direction that is reflective of statements made by senior Western officials. including the Secretary General of of NATO, that have said the situation in Ukraine will be resolved on the battlefield. Russia agrees. The situation will be resolved on the battlefield. The best the West can hope for, is that when Russia seeks to convene a gathering, which I believe will mirror what the gathering that took place in Tokyo Bay in September of 1945, one that transpired on the decks of the battleship Missouri, where a defeated Japanese enemy was given the opportunity to sign documents of unconditional surrender or die. So Russia will give Ukraine the opportunity to sign documents of unconditional surrender or die. The best the West can hope for is an early intervention where Russia can be convinced that it's in their best interest to offer these terms sooner rather than later. But this, again, will be done on a timetable dictated by Russia. And what that point will be, the pause point where Russia is willing to stop the trajectory of military victory and instead provide the possibility of unconditional surrender. Only Russia can make that determination. The West no longer has a vote. The West no longer deserves a vote. The West no longer should have a vote. The West no longer counts. The only party that matters today when it comes to resolving the Ukrainian conflict is Russia. And so therefore, I think it's incumbent upon us to work with the Russians to send a signal to the Russians that we trust in their humanity. We trust in their maturity as a nation. We trust in the maturity of their leadership, that they will not overplay their hand, that they will do that which is necessary to secure peace and security on Russian terms. And let's remember that Russian terms are not terms that the West cannot live with. Russia has already defined its terms. In December 17th of 2021, they provided two draft treaties, one to NATO, one to the United States, which they laid out in great detail the conditions under which they would like to see Russia and the West define a new European security framework. One that did not require NATO to disband, one that did not require any surrender on the part of the West, one that simply required the West to respect Russia's legitimate national security interests in the same way that Russia would respect the West's legitimate national security interests. I believe if the West signals to Russia that such terms would be acceptable in a post-Ukraine conflict environment, that is the foundation, that is the basis of a future negotiation. I'm not saying that the notion of the Vatican's intervention is flawed and should be forgotten. I'm just saying that the timing is not right. Maybe the Vatican can be that theater of neutrality where a new European security framework can be hammered out between a victorious Russia and a defeated West. But there will be no chance for any intervention at this stage so long as the cancer that has become Ukraine, the cancer created by the West, armed by the West, motivated by the West, until that cancer has been excised and removed from society in perpetuity. And only Russia can do that. There will be no negotiated settlement. And I think that that's just a realistic assessment of the situation. I'm also concerned that any effort to compel Russia to a negotiated settlement would backfire and only engender a harsher response by Russia. And any effort by the West to compel Russia through force of arms would lead to an escalation that could very well result in a general nuclear war. So I think negotiation actually is the worst possible course of action at this point in time. The best thing to hope for is to get the West to stop arming Ukraine, to get the West to walk away from any notion of the potential of Ukrainian victory, to get the West to accept the need and the necessity of mitigating the harm that has already been done to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation by yielding to the inevitability of a Russian victory and hoping that Russia will stop short of the total destruction of the Ukrainian state. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and I wish you a very successful conference.
This is Ray McGovern who's speaking now, the co-founder of the VIPS.
I would like to start with a slide that shows the words of someone I respect very much. I used to brief him every other morning when he was Secretary of State, George T. Shultz, not to be confused with Schultz. May we have the first slide, please?
Let me just read you what Secretary Schultz said when he reached the ripe old age of 100. He said, I want to offer some thoughts about how what we believe about the most important thing in human and international affairs, and that is the matter of trust. Trust is just as important in international affairs as it is in human affairs. We all know that good relations thrive when neighbors trust one another, and that life can become miserable if trust is replaced with suspicion and doubt. There can even be a choice between war and peace based on trust, and that will dominate the nations and relations between nations. He said that just before he died in November 2020. But suffice it to say that in 2 months, I mentioned that Lavrov told Ambassador Burns, look, niet means niet. You allow Ukraine into NATO, that is a red line for us. We will probably have to invade. There will be civil war there. Don't do it. Niet means niet. How do we know that? We have the embassy cable from Embassy Moscow. If I've seen one of those cables, seen about 405,000 of them, and they're genuine. And what he's saying here is what Ambassador Burns recorded. That was February 1, 2008. 2 months later, April 3rd, 2008, NATO, in its wisdom, so to speak, declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Moving on, March 2012, Obama is talking with Medvedev, who is then president of Russia, and he's caught on the microphone at a summit in Seoul, South Korea. And he says, Medvedev says, look, Vladimir wants you to address this missile system in Eastern Europe. He's really interested. Can we talk about that? And Obama said, well, let's wait till I win my election and then win re-election, and then we could talk about it. And then apparently Obama got his promise to do that, and no negotiations really took place. All right, now there was what I call a cameo appearance of trust. And that was in September 2013, after Obama personally, with Vladimir Putin personally, stopped having a war, prevented a war in Syria. Easy. They just agreed to destroy all the Syrian chemical weapons on a ship outfitted for such destruction, a U.S. ship under UN supervision. There was no war. The neocons who wanted that war were very upset about that. Why do I mention that? Well, because that was the last flash of trust. Vladimir Putin had an op-ed in the New York Times on September 12th, 2013, where he said, I really welcome avoiding war in Syria. I really treasure the growing trust, not only between our nations, but between myself, and President Obama personally. There's only one thing that I disagree with President Obama on, and he said just last week in a speech that the U.S. is exceptional. I don't agree with that. I don't think any one country is exceptional, writes Putin. I think there are big countries, small countries, countries that are closer to democracy, other countries not so close to democracy. But when God looks down on the world, he considers all nations equal. Well, there was the key. U.S. exceptionalism was going to prevail, and it only took 6 months or so before the neocons, who were really running Obama's policy as they are Biden's, staged a coup on the Maidan in Kiev, overthrew the duly constituted, duly elected government of Kiev, and put in a group very, very heavily influenced by pro-Nazis. That's what started it all. And you don't hear anything about that in the Western press. It's very curious. So that was the last part of trust. After the Maidan, after the 2-day pop on February 22nd, 2014, trust evaporated. Now, if you have any doubts about the U.S. orchestrating this coup, the reason that it's called the most blatant coup in history is because the plotters were intercepted in a telephone conversation 2.5 weeks before the coup, and that was put on YouTube. One of the plotters, Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs at the time, Victoria Nuland, was saying, well, we'll put yachts in your, we've got that all, we've got to nail this down. Vice President Biden will come in to solidify this, and then the ambassador in Kiev, our ambassador, asked, well, what about the EU? They're not going to like this. And famously, she uses the F word, which I'm not going to use here. She says, F the EU. I think Germany's part of the EU, so is France. There were no complaints about that I know of. I mean, if somebody said that to me, I would remonstrate. Okay? Well, so what happened next? Kiev was occupied by these people. Crimea was annexed, as one would expect, given the provocation. And the whole thing was this provoked? Well, the annexation of Crimea, I mean, if you don't think that this was provoked, it doesn't matter what John McCain or others said at the time. It was sure as heck provoked by the coup in Kiev. I wrote it up. I wrote a letter to the editor of Washington Post. I said, look, McCain is really wrong here. There is not one scintilla of evidence that it came into Putin's head to annex Crimea before the coup on the 22nd of February, 2014 in Ukraine. Well, next we have Minsk, which has really been given a good explanation what happened in Minsk. And we see the treachery, we see the bragging about, wow, isn't that clever? We held the Russians off. Ukraine was in no shape to face down the Russians. But we sent John Brennan, head of the CIA, to Kiev in April 2014, and he gave him the go-ahead. Go ahead and bloody those people in Lugansk and Donetsk. Give them a good bloody thing, and then we'll have a false kind of outcome, an agreement in Minsk. And we've talked about what happened at Minsk and how Angela Merkel and Hollande and Poroshenko himself say there was a little trick. Or this a trick? And we know how Putin feels about that. So what I like to do now is simply focus in on what I know about the reaction in Europe, and specifically In Germany, I lived in Germany for 5 years. I served there. I know a little bit about German history, or maybe more than a little bit. And I like to reflect on where we stand now with respect to the German people and their government. I have a very, very instructive book here. It's called okay, by Sebastian Hafner, the pen name for Raimund Pretzel. Now, he was a judge in training in Berlin in 1933. He was an eyewitness to so much of what happened there. And he wrote this diary, which was only discovered by his children after he died. He was quite a famous journalist or writer in Germany after the war, Sebastian Hafner. Now, what he wrote is very revealing to me, and it really raises the question. Here it is. He's talking about what happened in 1933 and how all of a sudden things fell apart. I'll read it in German and I'll translate it. Wie kann man erklären, das scheinbar Unerklärliche? Die völlige Abwesenheit von einem festen, durch Druck und Zug von außen nicht zu erschütternden Kern. Eine Härte. Eine alle Instanzen gerade erst in der Stunde der Prüfung mobilisierbaren Reserve an Stolz, Selbstgewissheit, Würde. Das haben die Deutschen nicht. Der März 1933 hat es bewiesen. Im Augenblick der Herausforderung erfolgte in Deutschland ein Nachgeben und Kapitulieren, kurz und gut ein Nervenzusammenbruch. Ende Zitat. Das war 1933. I'll continue in English. That was 1933. Now, that was 90 years ago. More than 70 years after World War II ended. I don't know if Raimund Pretzel's diagnosis of what most Germans felt in 1933 is correct or not. I haven't seen a better explanation for erklären die unerklärbar. So what I'm wondering about here is, would it not be possible to go in 90 years to realize who is deceiving whom, to face up and ask questions? I have two questions that your Außenminister, your foreign minister might ask. One would be to address to Washington. Do you know who blew up Nord Stream 2? I mean, John Brennan says it was probably the Russians. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but maybe it was the Russians, but you know. But we know. I'm certain that we know. Is Bayerbock afraid to ask? Well, I have three things that I'd like to point out. They go back to 2016
the last time I saw important people in Germany. If you have, what do they call Beziehungen, yeah. Then you get to see important people. The first was facilitated by my good friend Norman Birnbaum, who was a really close friend of a fellow named Frank Walter Steinmeier. Steinmeier told one of his chief lieutenants to receive me and to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about. And so a colleague and I went into this very august office, a very senior official, maybe not the deputy, but close to it. You could tell by the size of the office. And we started talking. I'm used to talking in candid terms, as you may know. And we talked about the putsch, the coup d'etat in Kiev. And his name was, what was his name? Philippe Ackermann, okay? He looked at me and he said, what coup? And I said, well, the coup on the 22nd of February, 2014. Steinmeier, your boss, was there. What coup? What coup? I got up and walked out. That was one example. Later, I was interviewing, or I was received by the chairman of the Verteidigungsausschuss des Bundestag, the Armed Services Committee of the Bundestag. His name was Wolfgang Helmich. Really nice fellow. Again, Beziehungen. You work the Beziehungen. So it happened to be the same day that Operation Anaconda, the biggest operation since World War II, Allied forces, NATO forces, right close to the Russian border. They had started. And so I said to Helmich, sir, what do you think of Anaconda? And he looked at this way and says, Germany is not involved. I said, but Herr Helmich, your soldiers are participating in it. Well, yeah, but it's not well, it was very clear from his body language, if from nothing else, that he was dead set against this, that he felt it foolish. And indeed, it was foolish in the extreme. The same kind of array of forces before Hitler invaded Eastern Europe. So my question was, well, Herr Helmich, can you not do something about this? And the answer was what I fully expected, in effect, no. On the same trip, I was asked to address a Fraktionsmeeting of Die Linke, okay? I was given 10 minutes because the matter of the shooting down of MH17 on the 17th of July, 2014 was very much in the air. And so I explained to them that, there's real doubt with respect to who shot that plane down. And that I'm convinced that if the evidence the U.S. is advertising is valid, let me put it this way. They would show it. Here's Secretary Kerry at the time in one of the interviews he gave. We saw the takeoff of the missile. We saw the trajectory. We saw the hit. We saw the airplane disappear from the radar screen. So there is really no mystery about where it came from. Well, okay, let's see the evidence. A long story short, I told the Fraktionsmeeting that there is evidence. I'm 90% sure. I know enough about U.S. intelligence collection capabilities in that area to know that the United States knows who shot that plane down. Then why are they reluctant to release the evidence? And I fully expected, oh, wow, let's ask. But what I got said was, let's go to the next agenda item. I mean, this was not inconsequential. It wasn't the seizing of Crimea. It was the shooting down of MH17 that led to the sanctions that were put in big time in earnest by Europe and by the United States against Russia, Russia being blamed, or pro-Russians being blamed for the shoot down. So again, not an inconsequential thing. So what I'm saying here is that those three experiences with Herr Ackermann, with the Fraktion, the Linke, and with Herr Helmich, made me wonder whether things have changed very much in the last 90 years. I don't know. I hope so. But if they haven't, then we're in more trouble than anyone really expects, because Germany is the fulcrum. There's a very different world now with the lily white West against the rest of the world, mostly of people of color, China, India, the whole rest of the world, okay? And so Germany can act as a fulcrum there, can act as a sensible country interested in friendly, at least non-hostile relations. And the way it has to do that first is recognize what's going on in Ukraine and what the reasons for the lack of trust Putin has. Last thing I'll say on that is joining NATO. Well, yeah, that's a big deal for Ukraine, but it is already, or was becoming already, a de facto member of NATO by having the next to the strongest army in Europe, trained and equipped by the West, and also having just everything it needed to pursue this misbegotten effort to seize not only the Eastern territories but Crimea. So what would I say at the end? I would say, now, has anyone had a chance to take a look at those view graphs? Because I'd very much like to show the last one. And while we're searching for that, let me just say this, that there comes a time, and this is such a time. There it is. Okay, can you put that up on the full screen? Okay, I wanted you to see that because this is what happened to me when I spoke out in our Bundestag, in our Congress, and said that if you nominate or if you approve the nomination of Gina Haspel, the torturer in chief at the first CIA black site, then this will be a blot on the CIA and on the nation. I spoke out very loudly and I said, you know, she ran that torture chamber with waterboarding and other heinous crimes. Will you approve her nomination? Well, you could see what happened to me. I was taken to ground, as they say. And of course, they approved it. Now, torture. I mean, tomorrow is the anniversary when the first prisoners were brought to Guantanamo with no redress, with no way to challenge their captivity. So let me just finish by this. Daniel Berrigan, who is one of my patrons and one of my teachers, wrote this. And it has to do with what we do besides getting educated, besides listening to what's going on. Here's what Dan wrote. Let us have peace, we cry, but at the same time, let everything remain normal. Let our lives stand intact. Let us know neither prison nor ill repute nor disruption of ties with family and friends. There is no peace because there are no peacemakers. There are no makers of peace, because making of peace is at least as costly as the making of war, at least as disruptive, at least as liable to bringing disgrace and prison and death in its wake. And so, such the words of Daniel Berrigan. Last thing I'll say is that when he spoke over Holy Week in South Africa and told people there that they had to do racial justice, this is 40 years ago now, the faithful came up to him after his homily, after his sermon, and they said, "But Father Berrigan, if we speak out, we may end up being detained. And what will happen to our children? What will become of our children?" And Dan answered very, very quickly. He said, "Well, if you are not speaking out, and if you are not detained, what then becomes of your children?" I think we need to do what was not done in 1933. We need not to be paralyzed by the powers that be. We need to speak out, and I have a certain faith, a certain trust, not only the American people, but the German people, that once they know the truth, well, the truth will set them free and avoid a war. And I applaud Helga and others for putting this seminar together. I just hope that all who are listening can think about what they can do rather than simply sit back.